Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode of Jungian Ever After, just wanted to let you know about two of our upcoming programs. First, we have another Salon series, a closer look at book one of Jung's Liber Novus. It's a deeper dive into just a single book of the Red Book. So if you attended the previous series and want to go deeper into the Red Book, this is for you. We also have a live webinar, Images of Abandonment and Repair, with Edward Porter Egan, and that's on November 15th. CEs are available for both of these programs. For more information, just visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of Jungian Ever After, a podcast about myths and fairy tales through the lens of Jungian analysis. I am your host, Reza, and joining me as always is my co-host and Jungian analyst, Dr. Adina Davidson. How are you doing?
I'm good this morning.
So, I have a quick note before we get going, which is that we were going to be getting this episode out weeks ago, and then I got COVID, and we had to reschedule. I'm still kind of recovering from that, so if there is any coughing or wheezing or sounds like that, that's why. I'm going to do my best to edit it out, but sometimes can't catch everything. And another note from the editing room. So, many months have passed, because after I got COVID, it activated my asthma, and after weeks of in and out of urgent care and ER and various things, I finally managed to get it under control with a daily inhaler. So doing all right now, but for a while there, it was kind of making me sick just to go down into my basement office where I do the editing. So I apologize for the delay on getting this episode out to folks, but as far as I can tell, I'm all right now, and hopefully we can resume business as usual. So, back to the episode. Today, we're going to be diving into our season of Greek mythology in earnest, and of course, where better to start than at the beginning? We'll be covering everything leading up to the birth of the Olympians that we all know, as well as their war for supremacy over the heavens and earth.
So, when Reza and I decided that we were going to look at the creation myths, I'm like, okay, well, what research am I going to do? Which is always my first question coming into these episodes. And I'm like, Marie-Louise von Franz wrote an entire book called Creation Myths. Highly recommend it. Again, Marie-Louise von Franz is the author. The title of the book is Creation Myths. And what she says, and this is a quote, creation myths are of a different class from other myths, hero myths or fairy tales, for instance. For when they are told, there's always a certain solemnity that gives them a central importance. From the point of view of feeling and emotion, creation myths are the deepest and most important of all of the myths. And I think when Reza tells the Greek creation myth, you will feel that sense of solemnity, that sense of somehow this is telling story that is of importance to me.
So, perhaps unsurprisingly, I love creation myths. I feel like they give us a window into the minds of the people who perpetuated them. And most, if not all, cultures have some form of creation myth. So I find it very interesting to look at the similarities and differences between them all. There's also kind of a strange sort of irony in creation myths, or at least I think so, because they are stories about the origins of the earth and its people that are themselves the inventions of those same people. So it's hard to say how much the creator of one of these myths truly believed it, or if they were like, well, this is a good story, but there's kind of this, almost chicken and egg sort of thing going on.
Right. So, for example, did the Greeks really believe that thunder and lightning was caused by Zeus hurling thunderbolts, or was that a metaphor for something?
Right.
I think that is a really good question that I actually think Edith Hamilton gets wrong, because she says that the that the purpose of these myths was to explain the natural world. And I don't think it was. But I also think that if you listen to Reza and Mai's comments about why we love creation myths, you will get a very interesting illustration of the difference between a thinking type, Reza, and a feeling type, Adina. Reza's like, oh, this gives us a window into the mind. We have ways of analyzing this that get at certain sort of facts and truth, right? And I'm like, oh, these have deep meaning to our souls. And I think you're going to see as we go through this episode that difference in what weight we give to why creation myths are important and interesting. You're going to see that difference repeating over and over again.
Well, looking forward to that.
So here's the Adina end of that. Creation myths concern themselves with the most basic problems of our lives. They're concerned with ultimate meaning, not only of human life, but of the whole universe. Why does creation exist? And again, I think that's where Edith Hamilton gets it wrong. She was probably a thinking type. She's saying that the Greeks were trying to make a case for what happens. And I'm saying, I don't know that was what they were trying to answer. I think they were trying to answer, why is it the way it is? And since we don't have any answer to those big questions, we invariably project an archetypal image onto that open space of those questions. Creation myths don't necessarily describe the origin of the cosmos, but they do describe, and this is again a quote from Marie-Louise von France, they do describe the origin of man's conscious awareness of the world. So we start out, and I am looking at an image of my granddaughter as I say this, 7 months old. We start out as babies in what Jung called, because he loved his Latin, the unus mundus, the one world. We don't have any sense of the differentiation between ourselves and the external world. Over time, babies understand the difference between themselves and a parent, themselves and objects, etc. We can see examples of that in when a baby smiles at you, they want a response. Or when they start to coo. If you make a noise back to them, they'll coo. They're clearly beginning to get a sense of the difference between themselves and another person. And then as they get a little older and they can start to manipulate objects, that's very interesting because it's like, I can act on an outside world. They understand there's a split, and that split also exists in consciousness. Their awareness of difference becomes more complex as they move farther into childhood and adolescence. They become more aware of the ways that they are different from other people and the outside world. As we move into adulthood and midlife, we begin to recognize that not only were we different than other people, but we also have deep connections between ourselves, other people, and the universe. And in this way, consciousness develops. So it starts as one world, then there's a split into me and other, and then there's a development of connection between me and other, or in Jungian terms, between the ego and self. Creation myths in Marie-Louise von France's framework are about the growth of consciousness. They all start with a formlessness, sometimes called chaos, but just there is no form, like the infant. Slowly things separate. For example, light and darkness, or in the case of the infant, self and not self. More and more difference is created or understood. Terrible mistakes are made, and humans or the individual human suffers. With enough effort, out of that suffering can come expanded consciousness.
So the infant analogy really hits different for me now that I have my own little one crawling around. just because it's totally crazy to see her going through these developments alongside just generally being more mobile. And what really blows me away is watching how even those physical developments can demonstrate how her understanding of the world is also advancing.
Exactly.
So this was a real highlight breakthrough moment that we needed at that time. But when she first started smiling, and they say, well, the very early ones are just gas, and then they're actually imitating you. And lucky for us, she smiles a lot, and that's really wonderful. But that was kind of our first indication of like, oh, she loves us too,
And the infant research is that all babies smile somewhere up between 5 and 8 weeks, but babies who are smiled back at a lot smile more.
Mm-hmm.
So that intuition of that this is a love expression is borne out by the research.
Well, that's of course comforting, but yeah, the next sort of step was she now has been crawling. She's 7.5 months or so, has been crawling for a week, maybe 2. And one of the big standout things is if she is starting to get distressed, maybe she's playing by herself, I'm not right there next to her, she will crawl towards me or crawl towards my wife. And you can sort of infer from that, oh, she has an understanding that I'm upset. Mommy will make me feel better.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's completely clear that's, and that she understands that there's a person outside herself who loves her and can help her feel better. That she is at the beginning of forming relationships, not just we are all one mush, but I'm me and you're you. And when we relate to each other, things are better, which is a really beautiful thing to watch. All right, well, back away from my granddaughter, who I'm sure Raisa and I could spend the entire episode talking about, and back to creation myths. We find creation myth motifs. So that unus mundus, that splitting, that light and dark, that more and more complexity, the birth of the baby, the birth of an infant, we find those motifs in our dreams and projections whenever we are about to make an important or transformative psychological development, if there's a leap forward in our own consciousness. Marie-Louise von Franz says, we know when we start to dream about babies or about the origins of the universe or about eggs hatching open, that a new world is about to be born. Something new wants to enter our consciousness.
Oh, to know the dreams of our children before they learn to communicate, because they must be full of these motifs with all the kinds of psychological developments that's going on all the time, right? We get to remember the things that were happening, maybe in our teenage years, right? We have some highlight dreams that were very memorable, and to some extent even now, but certainly the pace of development slows.
Hopefully, or we would be really overwhelmed.
Well, I think it's time that we got into the story itself. Now, this is going to be a little bit different from the Grimm fairy tales of season 1 because the stories are less clean cut. So we're pulling from Edith Hamilton's mythology, and she has her own commentary while she's telling the stories. So what I'm going to read isn't everything word for word from her book, but a paraphrased version that we put together for the show. So, the following is paraphrased from Edith Hamilton's mythology. Before there were gods, there was heaven and earth. Heaven and earth were the parents of the Titans. The gods were their grandchildren. Long before the gods appeared, in the dim past, uncounted ages ago, There was only the formless confusion of chaos, brooded over by unbroken darkness. At last, but how no one ever tried to explain, 2 children were born to this shapeless nothingness. Night was the child of chaos, and so was Erebus, which is the unfathomable depth where death dwells. In the whole universe there was nothing else. All was black, empty, silent, and endless. And then a marvel of marvels came to pass. In some mysterious way, from this horror of blank, boundless vacancy, the best of all things came into being. From darkness and from death, love was born, and with its birth, order and beauty began to banish blind confusion. Love created light with its companion, radiant day. What took place next was the creation of the earth, but this too no one ever tried to explain. It just happened. With the coming of love and light, it seemed natural that the earth also should appear. The first creatures who had the appearance of life were the children of Mother Earth and Father Heaven, Gaia and Uranus. They were monsters. They had the shattering, overwhelming strength of earthquake and hurricane and volcano. 3 of them, monstrously huge and strong, had each 100 hands and 50 heads. To 3 others was given the name of Cyclops, because each had only one enormous eye, as round and as big as a wheel, in the middle of the forehead. The Cyclopses, too, were gigantic and towering up like mighty mountain crags, and devastating in their power. Last came the Titans. There were a number of these, and they were in no way inferior to the others in size and strength, but they were not purely destructive. Heaven was a very poor father. He hated the things with 100 hands and 50 heads, even though they were his sons, and as each was born, he imprisoned it in a secret place within the earth. The Cyclopses and the Titans he left at large, and Earth, enraged at the maltreatment of her other children, appealed to them to help her. Only one was bold enough, the Titan Cronus. He lay in wait for his father and wounded him terribly. The giants, the 4th race of monsters, sprang up from his blood. From this same blood, too, the Furies were born. Their office was to pursue and punish sinners. They were called those who walk in darkness, and they were terrible of aspect, with writhing snakes for hair, and eyes that wept tears of blood. The other monsters were finally driven from the earth, but not the Furies. As long as there was sin in the world, they could not be banished. From that time on, for untold ages, Cronus was lord of the universe, with his sister queen Rhea. Finally, one of their sons, the future ruler of heaven and earth, Zeus, rebelled against him. He had good cause to do so, for Cronus had learned that one of his children was destined someday to dethrone him, and he thought to go against fate by swallowing them as soon as they were born. But when Rhea bore Zeus, her 6th child, she succeeded in having him secretly carried off to Crete, while she gave her husband a great stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, which he supposed was the baby, and swallowed down accordingly. Later, when Zeus was grown, he forced his father, with the help of his grandmother, the Earth, to disgorge the 5 earlier children. There followed a terrible war between Cronus, helped by his brother Titans, against Zeus with his 5 brothers and sisters, a war that almost wrecked the universe. The Titans were conquered, partly because Zeus released from their prison the 100-handed monsters who fought for him with their irresistible weapons, thunder, lightning, and earthquake, and also because one of the sons of the Titan Iapetus, whose name was Prometheus, and who was very wise, took sides with Zeus. Zeus punished his conquered enemies terribly. He chained them deep below the earth. Prometheus's brother, Atlas, suffered a still worse fate. He was condemned to carry the earth upon his shoulders indefinitely. Bearing this burden, he stands forever before the palace that is wrapped in clouds and darkness, where night and day draw near and greet one another. The house within never holds both night and day, but always one, departing, visits the earth, and the other, in the house, awaits the hour for her journeying hence. One with far-seeing light for those on earth, the other holding in her hands sleep, the brother of death. Even after the Titans were conquered and crushed, Zeus was not completely victorious. Earth gave birth to her last and most frightful offspring, a creature more terrible than any that had gone before. His name was Typhon, a flaming monster with 100 heads, but Zeus had now got the thunder and lightning under his own control. They had become his weapons, used by no one else. He struck Typhon down with a bolt of lightning, but while he lay vanquished, the creature's anger continued to surface as rivers of lava. Still later, one more attempt was made to unseat Zeus. The giants rebelled. But by this time the gods were very strong, and they were helped too by the mighty Hercules, a son of Zeus. The giants were defeated and hurled down to Tartarus, and the victory of the radiant powers of heaven over the brutal forces of earth was complete. From then on, Zeus and his brothers and sisters ruled, undisputed lords of all.
So, like other creation myths, the Greek myth starts with everything in a state of formless, dark chaos. I think that this is strikingly similar to Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. So we can really see archetypal projection in creation myths. We can really see how similar they are. I just wanted to give a 21st century example of this. I think, as I've mentioned in the podcast, I used to teach at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and I taught the psychology classes there. And one day I was teaching about archetypal creation myth patterns, and I had a student whose father worked at NASA Glenn, which is in Cleveland, was an astrophysicist. And this student said, "Oh, so the Big Bang is a creation myth, right?" And I'm like, "No, the Big Bang is, yes."
Yeah, people talks about how history repeats itself, but that's true of stories as well. So even places completely disconnected from each other.
Like ancient Greece and NASA Glenn.
Right. Or, if we think of the ancient Greek and then the biblical creation myth. But they'll have such similar themes and even plots within their myths. It's funny because, of course, science would be like, no, it's not a creation myth, it's a theory, right? And
tell me the difference between a theory and a creation. I mean, that's what this young man really made clear to me. Mm-hmm. Another way of putting it, and I'm quoting my teacher, Ken James, the archetypes aren't in us. We are in the archetypes. Mm-hmm. We cannot be separate from the archetypes.
Science does its best to sort of separate emotion, feeling, any of these sort of human things from study and conclusions. But it is, in fact, carried out by people who cannot take those things out of themselves.
Cannot be other than human.
I guess it'll be interesting to see how AI ends up.
Oh, that's
approaching
really
some of these
interesting.
things.
That would be really. But the problem is the way AI works. Like, so if you told ChatGPT write a creation myth,
sure.
What it would do is read every creation myth that humans and then sort of distill that and spit one out. So it's still based on us.
Yeah. AI as we presently know it, which just learns from scraping the internet, wouldn't be a good example. It would have to be a true artificial intelligence,
yes.
Which we're not there yet. That's like...
and we'll see if we ever are. It's an interesting question.
But to just go back for a moment to this thing of how people across the world end up coming to these same conclusions, my favorite example is dragons. Dragons show up in tales the world over, despite those cultures having no evidence of contact. They may be a bit different. Your Chinese dragons don't have wings, but are sort of like great serpents that kind of magically fly through the sky.
And they're kind of propitious. They're sort of good luck.
Right. You've got the kind of evil dragons that's slain by the medieval knight, right? I forget the most famous of those stories, but yeah, that's, another version. And then you also have, dragons showing up in stories in South America, in just all over the place, these varying iterations, small differences here and there.
And I've always kind of wondered if it's like deep neurological memory of dinosaurs, right? I mean, we all emerged out of tiny mammals that were running around when there were dinosaurs. And I just, like, one level of the archetype, or one pole of the archetype, is instinct. Archetypes go from instinct to emotion to spirit. And I wonder if at the instinctual level we have some dim memory of dinosaurs.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know of any dinosaurs that breathed fire, but that seems to be a recurring thing.
True. Good point. All right.
But yeah, regardless, you get the sort of idea that there's this stuff that there's no reason for these scattered populations to have had in common, and yet they do.
For me, it's one of the really mystical things about myth, is the way that certain myth patterns appear in cultures that seem to have no contact with each other. They just seem to be our human stories that we tell over and over again. For the Greeks, first comes night, the child of chaos, and Erebus, the unfathomable depth where death lives. In some mysterious and profound way, darkness and death give birth to love. The archetypal implication of this is that it is out of darkness and death that love is born. And I wanted to talk about a song that I love so much here. Usually Raisa is the one who gives our pop culture references, but I think the song, If We Were Vampires by Jason Isbell, sheds light on this. It is only in the knowledge and grief of our own and everyone we love's death that we can truly love. I wish we could play you the song, but, copyright law.
Well, we may not be able to play it, but we can certainly recommend it. And if listeners so choose, they could even pause the episode to go and have a listen and resume when they're done. Maybe even on the same app. But I don't know, maybe you can give sort of a quick summary, or was that sort of it? Just
Yeah, I can. There's an incredible image in the song, which I think I can give without impinging on copyright law, because I'm not quoting.
Yeah. Well, and you're not singing it.
and I could not. Which is that he says, if we were vampires, we would look at all of the people in love and just laugh. We would just go outside and smoke. But we are humans, and so we know that our time together with the person that we love is limited. And so we commit ourselves to each other and to that love because we know, and here's the quote, maybe we'll have 40 years, but one of us will spend some time alone.
It's interesting. I don't entirely agree, and I think this is that thinking part of me. I feel like it's impossible to know because we are mortal. But I feel like if I lived forever, I would be able to sort of fall in love over and over again. But I suppose it is still that kind of thing of if you're a vampire falling in love with humans, even if you yourself are not moving on, that they're not.
That you're going to lose this person, this
right.
Love. Yeah.
There's a great moment from the Troy movie, which I enjoyed. I don't know, people might debate how good of a movie it was or not, but about the Trojan War, Brad Pitt plays Achilles, and in a conversation he has with Briseis, who is from Troy. So they're on opposite sides of this conflict. He tells her, the gods envy us because we're mortal, because that makes everything
imbued with meaning.
Right, more beautiful, because we will never be here again as mortal beings. So whatever you may think of that film, I love that moment for it, and I think really captures the idea you're talking about.
I think it really does. And it seems really counterintuitive that love would be born out of death. But I think, as we've just discussed, it's actually very true. The Greeks had the sense that the interplay of light and darkness and love were the foundational principles of creation. They understood that love and light are inextricably linked. And I had a client recently who had this incredibly profound dream that is going to be very difficult to put into words. But basically what she dreamed was that the foundational thinking structures of the universe, gravity, or physical structures of the universe, E equals mc squared, the laws of thermodynamics, and the foundational feeling structure of the universe, love, were part of a whole. Like, we separate emotion and rationality. We separate physics and physical reality and feeling. And in her creation dream, they were all part of one whole. And again, I think that makes so much intuitive sense to me, that what the universe is really based on is all of those physics properties and love. And I think it's also what the Greek myth tells us.
Yeah, it's a little hard to wrap the head around. There are definitely scientists who study the brain and I think are working on quantifying some of these abstract things like love by trying to see if you show people images of the people they love while they're in a scanner, where does that light up in the brain, trying to quantify these things. It would be cool if we could find ways of demonstrating that it is somehow a force that the scientific community could actually quantify. It's one of those things where, yeah, we feel it, but there's no concrete way of identifying it.
And as a feeling type, I'm going, who cares?
Yeah.
So I also wanted to notice other archetypal patterns. So in this Greek myth, we have the depths of darkness and despair, and love is birthed out of that. That's a psychological development pattern, too, that I think maybe all of us, but certainly most of us have experienced. That it is out of the darkness, out of those dark nights of the soul, that something new, that lets us live a truer, wider, deeper life, comes out of the darkness. This is imaged in alchemy, where the alchemists looked for the gold in the Negredo, in the dark mud shit. That was where you looked for the gold. Another image comes from the East, which is the lotus flower. Lotus flower is one of the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen, but it has to have its roots in the mud. It has to be born out of mud.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this term, Negredo. So could you explain kind of what that is?
Yeah. So alchemy is turning lead into gold. It's the lead. It's the heavy, dark, inert matter. Psychologically, it's when we feel dark and inert and crappy and it feels like there's nothing there. Alchemy is going to remind us, no, there's specks of gold in there, in that state.
Okay.
Or that the lotus flower will be born out of that state.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think of when you're panning for gold, which isn't a transformation or creational thing, but just you're going through the rocks and the dirt and the river and whatever other gunk, just trying to sift and look for. Yeah.
I find it really surprising that the Greeks value love so highly. We often talk about romantic love as a creation of the medieval troubadours, or even a late 20th century phenomena. But the Greeks were saying thousands of years ago that love is foundational to the creation of the world. Nothing can exist without love.
That seems crazy to me that people would think it's a creation of medieval troubadours. Wouldn't it make sense that just love has been around as long as people?
This is a historically repeated theory of romantic love as we know it was created by medieval troubadours, or a wonderful, wonderful Jungian analyst that I'm just reading, Polly Young Eisendrath, says romantic love as we know it is a creation of feminism in the late 20th century. And I'm like, have you not read Eros and Psyche? I mean, it is clear to me that love is archetypal. And romantic love is archetypal.
Well, and if you asked just any person from a gut instinct, hey, how long do you think people have been falling in love? They'd look at you funny and be like, forever. What are you talking about? At no point would someone say, oh, I'd say probably about this time people started falling in love and it wasn't just about contracts. And it's like, well, look, just because there were marriage contracts, dowries, all that stuff before, it doesn't mean that people weren't falling in love.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But again, this is sort of the 21st century myth, is that this is a modern phenomena. But here we find it in Greek mythology. So I do want to say that we will definitely be talking about the myth of Eros and Psyche, which is such an important myth to me, and is the Greek tale of true love at some point as we cover Greek mythology, so in the next coming months. I want to look at another archetypal aspect of the Greek creation myth, which is the Titans. Von Franz, in her book, The Creation Myths, says the Titans are an example of an abortive or fundamentally flawed creation of humans. We have titanic impulses in us still. We can see them in our overpowering emotional affects, when feeling just takes us over and we have no control over it. These emotional states make everything huge, titanic. This can be negative. We may blow small problems or insults out of proportion, or positive. They can give rise to seemingly superhuman acts of goodness. For example, the heroism of the firefighters in 9/11 rushing into the building. That was a superhuman, titanic act.
That's interesting, since most of us look at the Titans as the villains. And so what you're saying is Titans, in addition to being these massively powerful beings, had these exaggerated emotions, and that's analogous to when we humans have outsized emotional responses?
Actually, one of the ways that I look at Greek mythology is that the Greeks personify aspects of human psychology. So that the Titans are the personification of those massively powerful parts of our psyche that can be both terribly destructive or positive, but are of overwhelming power, strength.
So sort of the mother lifting a car to save her child. That would be kind of the Titanic.
Yes, exactly, is an example of that Titan energy coming out. And I think what the myth tells us is that that energy needs to be contained. That uncontained, it's pretty destructive.
Sure. You can't just be like that all the time.
Yes, exactly. The Hulk. Right?
But that's my secret. I'm always angry.
So, yeah, we take the Titans into ourselves and embody their enormity. Or sometimes we project our huge affects, our huge feelings onto others and call it Titans. Nowadays, we might look at people with big feelings and label them crazy or mentally ill without really taking a look at our own uncontrollable emotions.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some tension in the fact that while we all have big feelings from time to time, they can sometimes be dangerous. So as the Titans are these monstrously powerful beings, so too can our strong emotions be powerful. They can make them scary, particularly when their source is misunderstood. We've got a lot better understanding of all of these things now. I've mentioned, the various studies that have been done where you show images to instill certain emotions and see where it activates in the brain. But not all too many decades ago, women would be diagnosed with hysteria simply for being unhappy. So, it was just such an expectation that they would stick to their lot in life and enjoy it, that it was unthinkable for them to have such negative emotions. And, while that is a ridiculous case in retrospect, it's also due to big feelings that people commit horrifying acts of terror and violence, which sort of, speaking of which...
Other places in the myth, we see fathers imprisoning and devouring their children. This is an example of an archetypal pattern of the dark face of the great father. Every archetype has a bright face and a dark face. The dark face of the parent archetype is cruel and devouring. Greek mythology is filled with fathers who kill their children. Agamemnon and Iphigenia, also probably a myth we'll cover. And I wonder, does this represent something archetypal in masculine psyche? There's plenty of murderous mothers, but they're always perceived as unnatural. Whereas these murderous impulses of fathers seem to come out of their nature. Doesn't mean they're good. We can see this in present day human behavior in parents who abuse their children, but also in parents who devour their children by only loving them when the child conforms to what the parent wants. The parent can only tolerate a child who is an extension of the parent. And in that way, the child's identity is merged or devoured by the parent. So again, I think this story of Zeus devouring his children is a personification of this archetypal capacity in humans to symbolically devour our children.
Yeah, it's sort of strange. There's also the Oedipus myth, where I believe, again, it starts with a prophecy that the son would murder the father. Is exposed, put on a mountain, doesn't die, taken in, goes back, fulfills the prophecy. I suppose one angle you could look at these things is self-fulfilling prophecy.
Or I think from the Greek perspective that you can never outrun fate.
Sure.
And you just make things worse if you try.
I suppose. But, there's that part of me that's like, what if you were just a good, nurturing dad? Your kid wouldn't want to kill you, right? It's sort of coming to the wrong conclusion. Mm-hmm. And, there's weird stuff when you get into sort of time loops, fate loops, all that sort of stuff. You never heard the prophecy, would it have come to pass, sorts of things. But ultimately, when it comes to fathers and sons specifically, it sort of feels like there's just this narrative of the son can't succeed or sort of be their own person until the father is out of the picture. And so you end up with all these stories of the father becoming this villain that
trying to keep the child from superseding.
Right. And that's just not a dynamic that you tend to get between mothers and their children, because they weren't set to inherit anything anyway.
And then from a truly archetypal Jungian perspective, we all have all the archetypes. So women have father archetypes just as much as men do. Men have mother archetypes just as much as women do.
Well, to insert another real life example with regards to the parent devouring their children, kind of recently, I suppose in the last few years as of recording this, we started to finally hear about the mistreatment of Britney Spears, which she endured from her father, who basically used her mental health as an excuse to completely take control of her life and career. So essentially, she was both his prisoner, and because she's a renowned and wealthy musician, almost a slave who generated him substantial income.
I mean, I think that's a great example of this archetypal pattern of a parent devouring their child, not allowing that child to be a separate person and only being allowed to function, to exist as an extension of the parent's needs.
Yeah. And, we don't believe that these things can happen to people who are celebrities or in money and things. And so I think it was a very surprising case when everyone was starting to hear all these details.
Yes, it was surprising to me. I had exactly that response. I also wanted to talk about the Furies. Furies cannot be destroyed, and they will pursue sinners relentlessly. Again, I think about this in terms of psyche's dynamics. One face of the Furies is the searing shame we may feel when we harm someone or fall short of our own expectations. We may be unfair with ourselves, or we may deserve the pain, but the pain is real and unrelenting. My own story of this is many years ago. There's a Starbucks underneath my office, and I went there and go there frequently, kind of as a break from work, right? I'll go and get something, but I'm really going to a different space. And there was a man there who would come pretty much every day, and he was in a wheelchair, and it was clear that he was getting more disabled over time. And he would spend most of his day kind of hanging out in Starbucks, talking with other patrons. And I avoided interacting him. I avoided making eye contact with him. I did not want to be of help to him. And I still feel this kind of disgust when I think about it. My analyst, the wonderful Joni Wayner, said to me, "Has he asked you for help?" He had not. And just realizing that kind of loosened the hold of the Furies on me, but not entirely. I still feel like that little bit of shame when I think about that. A different face of the Furies is that experienced by those who do not feel guilt, the sociopaths or the true narcissists. Because they cannot experience others as truly human, they are condemned to a life of profound loneliness. They can only hear the dry, empty voices in their own heads, filled with fantasies of persecution, greed, and hate. They're cut off from genuine friendship, from love, from family, from growth, from service to others. All of the things that make life worth living. This is perhaps the harshest and most terrifying face of the Furies, and why I often feel sorry for those people, even though that's very dangerous.
So, sorry, what's dangerous about feeling sorry for them?
Because if you feel sorry for them, they can use you. And will.
Yeah. I feel like the sort of most frontline example of this in the realm of true narcissists is billionaires. Maybe not all of them, but certainly some very
public figures.
Indeed. I mean, it feels like so much is said about Elon Musk these days, but because he's got his hands in kind of everything. And a well-known quote at this point by the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, who founded the company with Elon, and then they had a parting of ways, said about him, Elon desperately wants to save the world, but only if he's the one saving it. And I think that kind of captures that sort of narcissism.
Mm-hmm. And the isolation of it.
Right.
He can't really have a partner. He hasn't done what your baby has done. He hasn't seen other people as other to himself and really able to relate to them. He's still trapped in everything is me. Everything is an extension of me. And again, I think that is a very dark face of the Furies.
Yeah.
Another place in the myth that's psychologically very resonant for me is Atlas bearing the world on his shoulders. Sometimes our suffering feels meaningless or unending or unbearable. At these times, we may feel like we're being punished by God or the universe. We can feel like we are carrying the weight of the world. This myth provides such a poignant and evocative image for this type of experience. As far as I can tell, Atlas wasn't being punished for anything in particular. Zeus was just mad at him for existing. No matter what he may have done, his punishment was disproportionate. He is condemned to carry an impossibly heavy burden forever, with no chance of parole. Again, our lives sometimes feel like this. We will always be spending all of our energy or all of our life force just to carry our burdens. I think, fortunately for most of us, that's a temporary experience.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to hear about a lot of punishments distributed by the gods, both in this season, and if we get to Norse mythology, there's some kind of disproportionate punishments there as well. But, when it comes to Atlas specifically, this is where, again, that kind of, does this make sense? Part of my brain starts ticking. What was happening with the world before this punishment? If Atlas is carrying it, was there someone else carrying it? Was it just free falling through space forever? These are the kinds of things that hit the limit on what mythology can do for explaining the natural world, which is why you say, that's not what they're for. Also, what happened to Rhea? Rhea was...
She just disappears.
Right. She saves Zeus, and then that's kind of
exit stage
done.
Left.
Is she imprisoned with the other Titans? Is she just hanging about? There's nothing of her continuing to be mother to Zeus. You would think you wouldn't hold ill will against the person who saved you and then had you...
I had this horrible feeling that we're about to get 300 phone calls from people going, you didn't do your research enough. This is what happened to Rhea. But I have no idea.
Yeah, let us know. Send us an email. But I'm not familiar with any tellings of
Rhea's story past this. No.
Yeah, it's just, okay, she did her job. She saved Zeus. Now it's about the Olympians. So
I'm having a very feminist response to that also, but I think we won't go into that. But yeah, I don't really think myth is that useful for describing the natural world, right? I think it does a better job answering the big why questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose in life? What is our relationship to that which created us and to each other? And we'll continue to explore these big questions as we continue to explore mythology.
I don't know what you mean, big questions. I mean, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy clearly established that the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42. So if you don't understand that reference, I'm sorry. I guess you've got another book to add to your reading list. It's a very good comedic sci-fi by Douglas Adams, I believe, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But that is going to do it for today's episode. Our intro-outro music is a sample of Seculos Epitaph with the Lyre of Apollo by Lina Palera under an attribution non-commercial share-alike 3.0 international license. You can find the full version at freemusicarchive.org, link in the description. And if you like what you've been hearing, please leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast feed of choice, as it really helps other people to find the show. This show will always be free and available to all, but if you would like to monetarily support the show, you can now do so at Ko-Fi, that's ko-fi.com/Jungian Ever After. Also, Dr. Adina Davidson is a certified Jungian analyst who offers telesessions. You can find out more about her practice at adinadavidson.com or her Psychology Today profile. We'll be with you again next time, but until then, we hope your month is filled with exploring the worlds of imagination and storytelling.